Hi, everyone. Just for those who are just still joining, we have a Mentimeter pre-training survey, so the information is just on the screen. If you could go to there and fill out the quick survey, that would be great. I think we will get started though. So good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. I'm Veitania Lepani, and I'm the Program and GEDSI Officer for the Australian Water Partnership, and welcome to the AWP Partner GEDSI Training Workshop today. I'd first like to acknowledge the Ngunnawal people who are the traditional custodians of this land that I am speaking to you from today. And I also acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which each of you are joining from today, and extend this respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in attendance today. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people's traditional ecological knowledge and stories are passed down from generation to generation and continue to this day, supporting a symbiotic relationship with land and the water. This knowledge and connection to country is essential to managing rivers in Australia and increasingly drawn upon to support decision-making about water sharing and water management. So, we'll just run through the agenda quickly. And a quick note is that we'll be recording this session today, and to have it as an accessible resource to our AWP partners after the training. So just a quick note to let everyone know that. So the agenda today, we'll go through our welcomes and introductions, and then we'll dive into the expectations of the training. Then we'll have our guest speaker, Ipul Powaseu, to talk about disability and gender in relation to water and wash. Then we'll break for about 10 minutes, and then we'll dive back into the AWP context. Then we'll have a good session on disability inclusive development. Then we'll have an interactive exercise, and then we're hoping to wrap up at about 12:30 this afternoon. So we're very pleased to be hosting this virtual GEDSI training today, which will be facilitated by Jen Blyth, who's the Disability Inclusion Advisor for CBM Global Inclusion Advisory Group, and Melita Grant, who is an AWP Expert Review Panel member, the GESI Specialist on the ERP, and a Research Principal at the Institute for Sustainable Futures. So some of you may be familiar with Jen and Melita from the GEDSI training hosted earlier this year prior to our partner workshop training in Sydney. We had a great turnout to that training, and as we've seen an adjustment to virtual working and learning, we wanted to extend this training to our virtual platforms to extend more to our partners. We are also very pleased to have Ipul Powaseu as a guest speaker today, and we have Shannon Lee, our AWP Communications Manager, assisting with facilitation. So I will get Jen and Melita to introduce themselves shortly, but I would like to share with you a short message from our AWP Advisory Committee Chair, Bob McMullan. Bob McMullan has a distinguished career with the Australian government and has a special interest in welfare of people with disabilities in developing countries. He initiated the World Bank's Global Partnership for Disability and Development, which was adopted by the GBDD Task Force in 2005.
I'm really pleased that so many of you have decided to look at this issue of assisting people with disabilities in developing countries in your AWP work. Assistance to people with disabilities in developing countries has been a centrepiece of Australia's aid program for 10 years now. In fact, we've been recognised as the world's leaders in this area. it's a very interesting thing that it shows a middle-sized country like Australia can lead in an area if we apply intelligent leadership and resources. I think we could probably do something similar in the area of water, but I'm really pleased that we've been doing it now for 10 years in the area of disability. Now, why did we make disability a focus? It's quite simple. People with disabilities in developing countries are the poorest people in the world. The statistics are stark. They get fewer jobs. They have less access to education. They have less access to health services. They're more likely to be subject to assault and sexual assault. Their living standards are lower, their income is lower, their life expectancy is lower. They are the poorest of the poor, and they don't need to be. And Australia has focused a lot of resources on trying to assist them. There's one principle I think you all need to remember when you look at how you apply the principles about assisting people with disabilities to your AWP work. All the disabled persons organisations have the one message: nothing about us without us. That is, they want to be consulted, they want to be involved, they will help you to develop your programs, but they don't want it to be handed to them, they want to participate in it. And so I think with those principles and that recognition, you can do a lot of good work. And look, I just really encourage you all to apply the same level of commitment and enthusiasm and intelligent application of resources to assisting people with disabilities that you have to gender equity over recent years. Since I joined AWP, I've been impressed with the work that's been done around gender equity and social inclusion, and I'm really delighted that disability is going to become a new focus. So I encourage you all to participate, to enjoy the opportunities to learn about this area and to turn that training and participation to advantage in your future work with AWP. Thank you very much for joining with us in this important work.
So I'd like to hand over to Jen and Melita now to introduce themselves. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Jen Blyth. I'm from CBM Australia, part of the Inclusion Advisory Group. I'm really excited to be involved with you all here today. I've been working with Melita Grant, who will shortly introduce herself. I would also like to say Bob's presentation brought a really great point. What we're talking about, what I will talk about later today, DID 101, Disability Inclusive Development 101. You'll hear more about that later on. And I'm pleased to see so many people that have registered, and I'm looking forward to working together, sharing our knowledge and our thoughts and our experiences. Before I go on, I do want to be really clear. Our experience of disability is very diverse. What I may say may be different to experiences of other people with disabilities as well. I'd like to hand over to Melita to introduce herself as well. Thank you. Sorry, one more thing. I'm sorry, Melita. As you can see, obviously I'm deaf and I have two Auslan interpreters working today. So there may be a slight lag, maybe I sign too fast and then the interpreters need a chance to catch up, but you'll notice that as we go on. But thanks, Melita, over to you.
Thank you very much, Jen, and hello everybody. Thanks for joining us today in this virtual workshop. It's really wonderful to see how many people want to be part of this and want to, as Bob said, learn together and work together to improve the inclusiveness of the work we do with the Australian Water Partnership. So I'm lucky to have been part of AWP's journey in terms of focusing more on inclusive water management and turning the policies and the visions into practical steps that we can take in our projects. So I'm very happy to be part of this training with Jen and the team. and I look forward to your questions, your comments, anything at all that you have in mind that you'd like to draw this expert panel together to help respond to those questions and comments. Feel free. And mentioning that the chat box will be open at all times for you to pop in ideas, questions, comments, and myself and some other facilitators will be keeping an eye on that, and we'll pull those questions together and ask the various speakers as we go. So definitely use that chat function to engage with us throughout the workshop. That's pretty much it for now. I just wanted to move on to giving you a sense of who we are here in this group. Thanks to those who were able to complete the Mentimeter. I will now just bring up those results for you, and you can see this lovely range of people that we have with us today. Sorry, just multitasking here. Okay. So I just need to be able to manipulate this. Okay, we asked you what kind of Australian Water Partnership project or program that you're involved in. And we have a really great breadth here of projects, the majority being technical work and capacity building and events, workshops, conferences, that sort of thing. So that's useful for us to know, because then we get a sense of the type of activities you're involved in. Okay, and then we asked you to describe your role in terms of the AWP in a few words. We'll reflect on those comments after the workshop today and feed that into our second part of the workshop, having a better understanding of where you're coming from. We asked you to let us know what kind of experience you have in terms of applying gender equality, disability, social inclusion to your water or development programs. And most people feel like they have no experience, 0 years. So that's good that we have pitched this workshop more at a 101 type audience. But I know from looking at the attendance list, there are some experts in the audience as well. So they are their views and expertise are going to be very useful, especially in phase 2 of the workshop, where we do group work, scenarios, and really pull on the collective expertise of the group. And then we asked, what are you hoping to gain from the workshop today? People have mentioned that they would like practical approaches. They would like some strategies, how to effectively incorporate GEDSI into programming, improved understanding, some techniques and tools and frameworks, more examples of best practice. The word practical came up again, greater awareness and how to incorporate this into the project delivery. New insights and knowledge. There's lots of great comments there about deepening understanding and applying it in a practical way. So thank you very much to all of you who were able to complete that survey to help us understand where you're coming from. And then what keywords describe how you're feeling about today? This is pretty awesome. So interested, curious, excited, enthusiastic, pumped, got quite a few responses, hopeful, energized, ready to learn. Yeah, that's really beautiful. What a wonderful way to start. So thank you, everyone. That's exactly how we feel. Okay. So now I'm going to hand over to Jen again, and she's going to introduce our first guest speaker. Thank you.
Thank you, Melita. I'd like to say we are really so privileged to have such an amazing speaker with us here today. Ipul Powaseu. Ipul is from Papua New Guinea. Thank you so much for joining us today, Ipul. We're so excited to hear from you. Ipul is from Papua New Guinea. She is currently a PhD student at Deakin University, focusing on critical analysis of Papua New Guinea's social policy in relation to disability. She has over 20 years of experience in agriculture and socio-economic research. She's one of the first founders of the PNG, the Assembly of People with Disabilities, and now she has an advisor role with them. Her interests and spaces she likes to work in is the impact of climate change in relation to people with disabilities, gender and disability, as well as Indigenous gender and disability issues. We really appreciate Ipul's time coming to join us here today and present and to discuss. Now, thank you. I'd like to hand it over to Ipul. Thank you.
Thank you, Jen, for that short introduction. I am actually now in Papua New Guinea. Yet to complete my PhD, I'm in the final stage of my write-up. But I'd like to thank Jen for giving me this opportunity to be part of this workshop. And it's really important that for people with disabilities participating in this type of workshop, it brings to light some of the challenges that we face as people with disabilities and how we can inform how we can make work together so that we can move towards including people with disabilities. As Jen has highlighted, I am by profession a scientific researcher, having graduated with a Bachelor of Science degree in the area of environmental science. And I've spent 20 years in research, working in different national research systems in the country. I'm a person with disability, but I did not regard myself as one when I was working in mainstream profession. But in 2006, I was invited to attend a workshop where there were women with disabilities who had attended. Now, it was my first time to be in a group of people with disabilities, which for me, I did not identify myself with because of the issues of stigma and discrimination when I was growing up. But in that workshop, I was confronted with the reality of my identity as a person with disability. I heard stories from women who were attending that workshop of the difficulties and challenges they face as women, particularly in accessing public spaces, or the marketplaces. They told stories of how they would like to go to the markets, but the markets are not accessible. They sit in a wheelchair. And most markets in Papua New Guinea, you have to sit on the floor, display your vegetables on the floor. And so it was difficult for them. I also heard stories from the women about, the challenges they face when they are accessing the health services, the clinics. The nurses would tell them to wait while they serve the others first, as well as the woman who told a story about how she would wanted to come to the city. She was using a wheelchair, but she couldn't public motor vehicle because most of them are, big trucks. And so she couldn't, get up the vehicle. So these were the challenges that women with disabilities face at that time, or are facing here in Papua New Guinea, in many of the developing countries in the Indo-Pacific region. So that moment I was challenged that whilst I was well placed within the mainstream profession and working in the government mainstream arena, I realized that I was a person with disabilities. And here there were women who were really feeling the difficulties as a person with disabilities. And so my presentation this morning will really look at what it means to be a person with disabilities and what are the challenges as a person with disabilities, you know, in the community, you know, how people with disabilities, you know, relate to others within the communities, and also within the communities, you know, what are some of the difficulties or challenges or the barriers that they face, and at the societal level, you know, what are some of the challenges that we face. And after that, I'll also look at some of the basic principles of disability inclusion and how we can look towards including people with disabilities. So I'm going to kind of give an overview of these two areas, the challenges people with disabilities face, and also, you know, the principles of disability inclusion that we have to be aware of so that we can be able to try to include people with disabilities in our work. And I think the video by Bob McMullan highlights, you know, the reasons why it is important that we look at people with disabilities in our work. Including them means, you know, making better choices for, you know, humanity. So I'd like to start off by highlighting some of the things that or in an article by Queen and Einstein Kelslake, where they noted for persons with disabilities to be regarded as human beings, it pivots on three-dimensional view of reality. They further mentioned or initially mentioned that the CRPD, or the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disability, brings to light two things. It looks at what it means to be a person with disability, and secondly, how the CRPD pushes the boundaries of established human rights. So let me explain this further. What does it mean for a person to be regarded as a human being? Queen and Kerslake actually says and points out three-dimensional reality in what it means to be a person with disability. Firstly, the involvement of civil societies, and particularly people with disability organizations, is important during negotiation periods. And this can be situated in different contexts, like what Jen pointed out, that the context in, you know, developed countries is different to the context in low-income countries and developing countries. So what this means is that the insistence on persons with disability is important because it helps them to forge their own destinies, their acknowledgement of shared parenthood, a personhood who they are, and also the support, both formal and informal support systems that we as persons with disability always rely on, or would, you know, rely on to forge our own pathways, and the critical importance of this and what it means to belong. You know this, but also secondly, the CRPD pushes the boundaries of human rights doctrines and looks distinctly at the issue of human identity and how the interaction of these identities compounds the experience of discrimination. For example, for me as a woman with a disability living in an indigenous community, I face a lot of difficulties, and women like me face a lot of discrimination. So identity is forged largely by human interaction, the very thing that is denied of by many people with disabilities. So when we talk about, we have to look at a human rights-based approach. These are some of the factors that we have to consider when we, because of the different identities that we forge when we are interacting with others. So I really bring this to the discussion. I'm bringing this to the discussion so that it'll prick our conscience when we are talking about people with disabilities and how we can include them into the mainstream activities that we have in the area of water. So let me take you back to my story. I left my profession in 2010 and ventured on a journey to understand people with disabilities are often left out in mainstream development programs and interventions. And this actually forms the social inclusions are, as well as to find out the facilitators to social inclusion. And for today, I'd like to just look at the challenges that people with disabilities face. So I looked at the participation and interaction of people with disabilities at the different ecological spheres of interactions, at the individual level, the relationship level, the community, and the societal level. And this is what I found, and it's commonly shared by many people at different contexts and situations. We know that people with disabilities are not homogeneous. We have different health needs and different level of functioning due to the types of disability that we have. And this is very important in your work when you are looking at how to include people with disabilities. We do not come with, one type of types of disabilities. We have diverse, but also diverse functioning level as well. So while I have polio and I sometimes use a wheelchair, but I use a walking stick, and so I'm different to someone who walking stick is paraplegic and uses a wheelchair and cannot move out of the wheelchair. So those are the different levels of needs that you have to be considerate of when you are looking at your type of work at that individual level. Self-confidence, and Bob McMullan actually pointed that one out, that a lot of people with disabilities lack the confidence, not because they don't want to, but many of us, or many of them, are not well educated, and therefore that lack of confidence makes them not to be assertive to take up their space in mainstream activities. When you are in the rural area, you will notice that lots of people with disabilities will not be coming, and because of some of the reasons, there are barriers that they will face, and we have to be considerate of that as well. A lot of them face multiple discrimination. When you look at water, a lot is depend on others to water for them, or sometimes they would they would have someone to assist them to go and fetch water if they can be able to. And some face discriminations in those areas, sexual abuse and all that. So these are areas that we really need to look at. Social and practical skills. People with disabilities, particularly women and girls with disabilities, don't have the power of choice to make decisions on their own in communities, and therefore they have devalued role society. A lot of people with disabilities do not have support networks, or do not have that social capital that they can have or create networks with others, because some of the material opportunities they do not have with them that allows them to form those social capitals. So at the individual level, these are some of the challenges that people with disabilities face. At the relationship level, the issue of stigma and discrimination is one of the areas that people with disabilities, for me, when I was growing up, these were some of the challenges that I faced. It affected families as well. Sometimes we expect that persons with disabilities don't have the capabilities and therefore include them in maybe. But you know, this becomes our responsibility well as development partners, that we have to look at how best can we build that justice. Overprotection and being sheltered is one area. I was overprotected by my parents. They didn't want me to go to school because they were worried that what other people will say about me because of my disability. Unfriendly environment that people with disabilities faces are some of the challenges that they face at that relationship level when they want to interact with others. And also lack of support. It is very expensive for people with disabilities, and it provides, increases the level of poverty at the family level. When household has people with disabilities, it affects the women, the girls there, because they have that responsibility to look after persons with disability, and it can impose on family resources. Now, at the community level, you can look at the environmental and institutional infrastructure. So accessibility and transportation, technological support, so, assistive technologies. The perception of cost of productions. Oftentimes, projects are concerned that it is costly if we include people with disabilities because of these added costs. But studies have shown that if you include people with disabilities or marginalized group, it reduces the loss to GDP. At the societal level, perceptions of disability, the mental models that fosters exclusionary attitudes and practices. Many times we think that people with disabilities are not able to do anything. And so we leave them out of many of our. The structural and social, these are some of the factors that with disabilities. Portrayal of disabilities. Many times the media portrays people with disabilities as, look at this person, it's how lucky that person is to be able to do. They are human beings. And so sometimes we tend to look at them as they have just won an award when they come out to do something that, they may have the ability to do it, but because of our perception, we have limited that opportunity for them. And policy and legislations are very important when we are looking at how to include people with disabilities. Policies at both at the organizational level and as well as at the political level. So what can we do to demystify this perception of persons with disabilities as the other? And therefore, how often we leave them behind because of the factors that I have outlined above? As development practitioners, whether in the private sector, as academicians or practitioners in the field, we have a play to reverse this portrayal of people with disability and recognize them as human beings and with rights to equal participation as any other human beings with alienable rights, which is God-given. So I'd like to just bring to you a few of the guiding principles towards disability inclusion. And this is, so I'll just go through, and after this, if you have any questions, then it would be good for me to answer them specifically. But the issue, one of the guiding principles is non-discrimination and equality. Persons with disabilities must obtain meaningful access to the water services and benefit on an equal basis with other persons. Projects should not exclude or discriminate against persons with disabilities in providing access to resources and project benefits. Because disability is a cross-cutting issue, persons with disabilities should also be considered among the beneficial groups of all water projects. Accessibility is another guiding principle. The principles of accessibility and universal design, it should be addressed in all outputs and deliverables, including the built and virtual environments and service delivery. This is in recognition that people with disabilities are not an homogeneous group. They have different types of impairment as well as come from different socio-cultural levels. The third basic or guiding principle is the principle of inclusion and participation. Meaningful participation of people with disabilities is essential for genuine empowerment and change in the community. Meaningful participation ensures that people with disabilities participate and benefit from development efforts and leads to broader benefits for families and communities. And how do we do that? We must ensure that people with disabilities and their representative organizations are actively included in consultations. We must also create space for their leaders who have been successful to share in their advocacy roles, to share this with broader mainstream advocacy initiatives, so within the various projects. We must also incorporate the needs of people with disability into our broader advocacy programs. Ensure people with disabilities play an active role. Partnership and collaboration is another guiding principle. Disability inclusive development is facilitated through strong partnerships with government, bilateral multi-agencies, and civil societies, in particular disabled people's organizations. And so the recognition of the people with disabilities representative organization, the DPOs, is important when we want to look at inclusion. The twin track approach is also one of the areas that we must look at when we want to include people with disabilities, and it comes into or it's implemented to concurrent initiatives. The disability mainstreaming is ensuring that the organization and its programs include a disability perspective and are fully accessible to and inclusive of people with disabilities. But the other area is really looking at disability-specific initiatives, and these are activities specifically targeted at people with disabilities in order to increase their empowerment and participation. So say if you are running a training and you really need to take into consideration how can you bring people with disabilities to that event. You have to look at the accessibility. Is the venue accessible for people with disabilities? Are there certain things that we need to do so that we can bring people with disabilities to the workshop? So having a sign interpreter, having ramps that people in wheelchairs can come in. People who have vision impaired, you really need to consider the type of disabilities, the different types of disability and the functions that they have. So what I have actually outlined to you is broadly some of the factors that impedes effective inclusion of people with disabilities in mainstream development intervention. And how we can use disability inclusive guiding principles disabilities into the picture. Whilst wash and water interventions, I now allow the floor open so that you can ask me questions that may be related to specific areas. Thank you for allowing me to speak at this workshop.
Thank you very much, Ipul. That was a fantastic introduction to so many of the key concepts and reasons behind why we're here today. We did have one question that just came in that was about the twin track approach you just mentioned, because the audio just flipped out a little bit as you were explaining that. You explained the mainstreaming and targeted being the two twin tracks. I'm wondering if you could perhaps elaborate a little bit more on what it looks like to have that twin track approach and what kind of ways you can mainstream disability inclusive approaches. And you gave the example already of targeted approaches being accessible events and that sort of thing. But anything more you can talk about the twin track approach, because I think that will be very relevant to a lot of our audience. Thank you.
Okay, yeah. You know, one of the things that when I am asked to participate in workshops, and particularly by NGOs, and they often tell me that, oh, we go into the communities, but we don't see a lot of people with disabilities. And I often, you know, refer them to this film that I watched, you know, some years back, the Field of Dreams. And the Field of Dreams, you know, the genre behind that is you build and they will come. You build and they will come. And I think that's what disability mainstreaming is. If you make your activities inclusive and, you know, it's accessible, if it is, you know, inclusive, if it's in an environment where people with disabilities are able to come, you provide the resources, they will come. So I think that really, that is really what we really need to do. You know, many times we said they are not there, but they're actually there. But because the environment is, there's a lot of barriers, they are there, they cannot be able to come. So disability mainstreaming is really removing those barriers so that people with disabilities can come. Now, when they are there, they also have to be supported to participate effectively. And I've outlined some of the targeted or the specific initiatives that you have to, you know, allow so that they can be able to participate effectively. So, you know, make it accessible so that, or make it inclusive so that people with disabilities can come. Remove some of the barriers that impedes their inclusion or involvement. I hope that answers the question.
That's great. Thank you very much. I think that's a great recommendation as well. I've put the name of that in the chat box if people want to look that one up. Movie recommendation. Any other questions at this stage for Ipul about any of what she shared with us, or any questions you have in mind about how to take that thinking and apply it into your programs?
I wanted to add, Ipul will be involved with us throughout the whole presentation today. So if you do think of a question later on, I'm sure you can ask it at any time.
Yeah.
Is that right, Ipul?
Yeah.
Great. Back to you, Melita.
Thank you. Yes, very good point. There will be lots of opportunities to engage with our speakers throughout the day. We have a question that's just come in, and then we will move to the tea break. Thank you, Kathleen. Can you point to some successful disability inclusion interventions? And do you recommend identifying representative organisations in relevant countries? So I know they're big questions, but yeah, anything, Ipul, that you have to share at this point, and we can also return to that question throughout the session, the first one. Thanks.
Okay, so let me refer you to a project that we did here in Papua New Guinea. Now, it's not water specific, but it was actually on road accessibility. And this is a project that I actually was the project officer for. But I decided to do it differently. Rather than I was the project officer, I actually discussed with the project partners, which was the University of Melbourne and CBM NOSO partnership, that the project actually recruits the DPO. and I was coming as a like a contractor, just to contract basis, you know, to lead as and when. And in that project, we recruited people with disabilities to be researchers in the project. And what we noticed is that when people with disabilities went out as researchers to do interviews, it brought out, you know, the myths that, you know, policymakers and implementers had around people with disabilities. So the issue of a lot of people did not realize that people with disabilities also are consumers of, you know, the road services or the services that leads to opening up of accessible roads. So, you know, like they sell their produce at the, you know, the roadsides and all that. And so including people with disabilities as researchers and core partners in this project provided a lot of awakening to policymakers, that oftentimes we tend to look at people with disabilities as just beneficiaries, but not consumers of projects. And so it changed the way they looked at road accessibilities. They started to look at what are some of the challenges. So people with disabilities actually showed some of the challenges that roads or roads that are not accessible would impose. So for example, in Eastern Highlands, in Goroka, we had people with disabilities with different types of disabilities. There was people who had blind, and they're walking along, you know, auditing the roads, and they noticed that, you know, the drains are open. That was quite difficult for them to go across. So that project actually brought to light that there were people with disabilities who used roads, but the roads are not accessible for them. It was difficult for them to cross the road. So in that project, there were a lot of things that came out from it. And one of it is the effective participation of representative organizations with project partners. If you have that relationship, it brings out some of the challenges, or it points out some of the challenges that we may not see, but the experiences of the people with disabilities, you know, pointed out within the project partnerships, actually made it a project, or if you want to really change, you have to include beneficiaries of the activities that you are, and particularly those that are marginalized, that are not accessing the activities. So it brings the, you know, hidden challenges that you may think, or, you know, we're building a well and, you know, we can just build it up on the hillside. But if you include people that having a well on the hillside is very difficult because of the accessibilities and all that. So I think that's really what we mean by, you know, when you work closely together with people with disabilities and their organizations, it brings to light many of those areas or the challenges, the reality that people face, and particularly people with disabilities.
Thank you, Ipul. That was a fantastic answer. And we will take a break now, but I just wanted to let you and Jen know that we've had some more fantastic comments and questions come in around the issue of value for money and how to justify budgets, that kind of a concept. And then also asking for examples about how these sorts of initiatives and practices have been sustained over time in government and other organisations. And then we also have a thank you from one of our participants for the well-informed presentation and the recommendations such as mainstreaming and targeted initiatives. And a big thank you from some other participants. So we'll leave this part of the session here. We'll get back to you on those other comments and questions throughout the day and also in part 2 of the workshop, but it's great to be hearing and seeing what's coming to mind as you get into this content. So now we're going to have a little 10-minute break, and if you could please come back at 11:05, then we'll start again, and Veitania is going to pick up the conversation there about some of the practical tools and resources that the AWP has to support us in this work. So thank you, and we'll see you at 11:05. Cheers.
Okay, so I think we'll get started on the next sessions. So I'll be taking you through AWP's commitments to GEDSI. So just a bit of AWP context, GEDSI and AWP activities, and more specifically on how GEDSI criteria is assessed in partners' submissions. So gender equality, disability and social inclusion are cross-cutting issues for water resources management. And one of AWP's key strategic directions is for the program to build awareness of, commitment to, and implement principles of GEDSI throughout our work. So AWP has operationalized our GEDSI policies since 2017, and we recently revised the policy earlier this year to include a stronger disability inclusion focus. The policy commits to integrating GEDSI into our operations and activities and communications, but also includes support to partners on understanding principles of GEDSI and improving outcomes in your work. The GEDSI policy also aligns with the Australian Government's Development Policy Partnerships for Recovery, so Australia's COVID-19 development response. And then this DFAT policy reaffirms the commitment that disability inclusion alongside gender equality remains a cross-cutting priority for Australia's international engagement in development, humanitarian action and human rights. AWP is focusing more on supporting partners for proposal design phase of activities with technical support to think critically about GEDSI components and submissions. So we also do this through webinars and training such as this, and we also provide some guidance documents as well. We engage our GEDSI specialists within the expert review panel to review submissions of proposals, also technical reports, and to provide assessments on how GEDSI considerations are incorporated into proposals. The assessments are based upon a set of criteria that address GESI, which we'll go through shortly as well. So we aim to facilitate an exchange between the ERP members and partners when assessments of proposals are made. So this is an opportunity for partners in order to address any comments that are made and to strengthen the GEDSI components in their proposals. We also encourage partners to utilize the AWP partner guidance for partners document for addressing GEDSI and proposals. And this sets out the criteria that the submissions are assessed against and some practical suggestions on how to meet these by activity types as well. So these are some of the AWP activity types that we support. So events such as workshops, conferences and study tours, policy and strategy development and advice, twinning, so organizational sharing of knowledge and expertise, capacity building and knowledge sharing, coordination, and also technical work. So I'll run through the first two of the GEDSI criteria. So has a GEDSI analysis and risk assessment been undertaken? To what extent has the GEDSI analysis and risk assessment influenced the development of the submission? And does the submission outline an appropriate monitoring and evaluation system? and have sufficient resources been allocated for addressing and achieving GEDSI outcomes. So the third and fourth are largely dependent on the work put into components 1 and 2. So I will quickly run through the first two criteria points. So for criteria 1, undertaking a GEDSI analysis is critical as it informs how and to what extent the proposed activity needs to address GEDSI and to respond to potential issues. So analysing the context in which the proposed activity is expected to take place allows for a bit more of an understanding of a number of factors. So this may include how women, people with disabilities, or marginalised groups are affected by development challenges that the proposed activity seeks to address. What groups the partner is identifying as marginalised. So this could be the elderly or different ethnicities. Also understanding the barriers that usually limit or prevent people with disabilities or marginalised groups from benefiting from or participating in the activities similar to the one being proposed, and how to engage with gender experts or disabled people's organisations. So the extent of a GEDSI analysis required will depend on the size and type of the proposed activity, with a more detailed analysis for activities with a large budget or potential social impacts as well. For criteria 2, information and knowledge obtained through the GEDSI analysis should be fed into the development of the submission and influence its design and approach to implementation. So when assessing submissions, the ERP will seek to understand the extent to which the GEDSI analysis has influenced the development of the proposed activity, and by looking at how the partner intends to, so for example, seek and take advantage of the opportunities that the activity offers in GEDSI, anticipate and mitigate any potential negative impacts on women, people with disabilities or marginalised groups as a consequence of the activities. And then also making sure that women, people with disabilities or marginalised groups are treated as active and equal participants of the activities. So these are sort of the guiding principles that Ipul touched on previously. So the guidance for partners document really delves into some of these practical suggestions and goes through each of these 4 criterias and how to address them in your proposal. So that's just a general overview on the AWP's commitment to GEDSI and how the type of criteria that we're looking at through your submissions in addressing GEDSI. Are there any questions in the chat before I hand over to Jen?
No questions in the chat at this point.
Mm-hmm.
I just might wait to see if anyone would like to add something now about AWP's GEDSI criteria or the overall approach to supporting partners in applying GEDSI principles in their practices. And yes, thank you, Shannon. The guidance document will be shared with everybody next week, the updated guidance document that Jen and myself have contributed to, and it builds on all of that experience that AWP has built up over the years and that Veitania just explained. So that will be available next week.
Yep.
Any questions from anybody? Just one comment here. Good information, challenge to respond to briefs in technical and gender context within the page limit.
Yeah, so that is something to consider. I suppose it also depends on the scope of the activity too. So that's good feedback. How to properly balance the GEDSI analysis in the relation to the activity and how that feeds into the submission. So we'll take that on board.
Thank you. Yeah. Another comment has come in. If the project brief does not provide background information of GEDSI issues, how do you undertake a risk assessment? Okay, so that's if their tender documents don't include information about the context and the GEDSI issues, how is the consultant or the organisation meant to respond to those issues? I'll just start from an expert review panelist perspective that we expect partners and consortia to have done a bit of background reading and research themselves, and to demonstrate that they've looked into the issues in the context that they're working in through desktop research, but also through the on-the-ground partnerships and connections that they already bring because they've got experience with that, or they intend to bring by building a team that is made up of organisations that have that expertise. So through building initial partnerships in response to a tender document, that will come through in your application that you've started to build those links, made those inquiries, and have investigated some of the issues from that context. Desktop research will only give you so much, but there are definitely some great sources to give you a little bit of context and some key issues that might be pertinent to that particular project from that context. A full risk assessment, of course, has to be informed by a carefully thought through and grounded gender equality, disability inclusion assessment. Veitania, would you add anything else to that in terms of how do organisations respond to the on-the-ground issues in their risk assessment processes?
No, I think you covered that off well. You know, expect to see some sort of, you know, background research being brought forward in the submission, understanding of the context. Yeah.
Great. Thank you. Thank you for that question, Paul. That's excellent. Anybody else have questions just for the next 2 minutes or so? One other thing I would just add as well, when you receive the guidance document next week, is that there are some very handy tips and tricks, concrete ideas. And so if in your applications and conceptualizing of your projects, you look at those lists and as a team and in that partnership approach, talk about which of those tips and tricks may or may not be applicable to your specific project, and then you demonstrate you've had a think about those and applied the ones that you think are most relevant and are most realistic. That will really help your application, but also help us as reviewers to know that you've engaged deeply with that guidance. So I just give that as a bit of a suggestion as well. And it's the guidance document, for those who have seen the version that is in existence at the moment, is divided into different types of initiatives or interventions. So capacity development or events or technical support or twinning, etc. So the tips and tricks are nuanced for those sorts of activities. Okie dokie. Well, Veitania, I'll hand back to you now. Thank you.
Sure. So Jen will take over now for her disability inclusive development session.
Great. I'm just setting up my screen to share. One moment, please. I hope everybody can see me and the slides okay. Please let me know if there's any issues. Also, I do want to let you know, if there's any questions or anything throughout the presentation, you can pop them in the chat and interrupt at any time. That's fine, that's welcomed. I'll talk about disability inclusive development. Some of these things may be things you already know about. It may be new to some. I'm hoping to also address your questions earlier about how to proactively include people with disabilities in your projects, but I think Ipul really did an excellent job of explaining that in her presentation. I also hope to answer some of your questions as well. Okay, I'll get started. So I just want to do a brief little introduction about why you need to consider disability inclusion. Veitania did already go through this. Sorry, excuse me. And it's really, you have to think about people with disabilities. It is really important. People with disabilities are human. They're part of the diverse range of people we have. Australia does have policies. Foreign policy white paper, as you can see on the PowerPoint, DFAT's Development for All strategy, which has been extended for another year. It'll finish in 2021. Partnerships for Recovery, Australia's COVID development response. They all really recognise that disability is a cross-cutting priority. The 2020 Agenda and Development Goals also highlight this, that disability inclusion is important, specifically goal number 6 and 6.1, which say by achieving that, universal and equitable access to a safe and affordable drinking water for all. All is what's in bold, and that's what's important. That's the key word, affordable, safe drinking water for all. Australia has also ratified the Convention of Rights of People with Disabilities, the 2008, which means that all of the policies, fundings needs to comply with disability inclusion. And that is a really vital part of the process. So, what is disability inclusion development? As Ipul said earlier, well, actually, I'll let you all know, I may repeat a few things, but I think it's really good reinforcement of this information. Disability inclusive development is two parts. One is the process and the other is an outcome. The process means you're making sure that people with disability are involved and included from the start. That means the planning, the implementation, and at the end, through the review period. Outcomes means that everybody has an equal benefit to the project. Not only a partial benefit or no benefit at all people need to benefit equally from the project. I've got two quick examples. Water irrigation. You'd make sure that you include people with disabilities through the planning stages, where and why throughout that whole part. Farm water resources management. You would make sure that that's accessible for farmers who have a disability, that they can come and be involved in training, that they can also learn and benefit from trainings like that. So they're just some two quick light examples. While we think about inclusion, what it really means, people are included. The core concept is from the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development Goals, ensure no one is left behind. No one is left behind. You would be familiar with the concept of intersectionality. People are diverse. People have various different identities, different characters, roles they play in their life, whether it's age, gender, disability. They're access to education, socio-economical background, ethnicity, indigenous, and so on. Some people can participate easier than others. Others aren't able to participate equally. You are people who are responsible for running projects. That means you're responsible to make sure everybody is included equally, that the trainings are accessible and inclusive for everyone. Inclusive development. I've got some great documents here up on the slide. You can see these images. Means you really deliberately target people to include them in your work. And that means that you need to change your project. You need to make sure that you can be adaptable. Like Ipul said before, build it and they will come. Yes, that's very true, but you also need to build it in a way that people can come and can access it. It's not enough to say, okay, we're going to provide this. Oh, and if people don't come, oh, well, bad luck. Oh, they didn't want to. But maybe it was because your project wasn't actually accessible for everybody's needs, or the information wasn't disseminated in a way that was accessible. So you need to build it in a way that they can come to it. Or they then can make an informed decision that they can decide not to come. The 4 images here up on the screen. And also there's a 5th one which isn't included, but I'll cover that a little bit later on. The first one, exclusion. You see the red and purple people. Very standard concept of exclusion. Very heteronormative example, men and women. And outside of that circle, there's people with disabilities that are just excluded, not thought about. They're not important enough to be part of what's going on in the circle. Segregation, the second image, is where sometimes people have the best intentions and they want to be inclusive, but they also separate and segregate the events. They'll progress one thing with one cohort of people without disabilities, then run something else for people with disabilities. And it ends up being segregated. Yes, maybe some goals may be achieved, but there's no there's no mixing, there's no collaboration between the groups. Integration, the third picture, quite similar to segregation, where you are still including those people, but not quite as such. They may have access to the same things. If I say you're providing a training, you give the exact same training to a group of people without disabilities and a group of people with disabilities, but you would hold it in separate rooms, separate forums at different times. Which means, yes, they're benefiting from the same information, but they're not exactly socializing together. The 4th image, occlusion. You can see everybody's together in the circle. Now, the new picture I alluded to earlier has a heading that says they decide, which means they can decide. Those people with a disability can be informed enough to make a decision whether they want to be involved or not. Maybe they'd rather stay segregated, or they'd rather an integration approach, or they'd rather a more inclusive approach. It's them having the autonomy to make the decision rather than you making it for them. Yeah. Some examples of people who are at risk about exclusion. We're talking about people with disabilities. It's also really important to think of the same ideas, concepts, and principles to apply to all people, not just those with disabilities. For all, women and girls, and I'm sure a lot of you now are familiar with the higher risks of exclusion for women and girls. People with little or no education, people who are illiterate, people who have AIDS or HIV, displaced peoples, young parents or child-headed households, people with disabilities, people who live in remote or rural areas, and ethnic minorities. But guess what? These people can have multiple intersections. In one, you could have a person with a disability who's a woman that lives in a remote area who is illiterate, which means there's even more risks of being excluded, more capacity to be excluded. I mentioned earlier about the Convention of the Rights of People with Disabilities. The Convention it explains the human rights and how they apply to people with disabilities. It's not a new thing. They're not new rights. It's not saying that people with disabilities need extra special treatments. It's just saying that we deserve to have the human rights the same as everybody else. And it's an example of how it can be interpreted to apply to us. The Convention says that disability means the following. Persons with disabilities include those who have long-term physical, mental, intellectual, or sensory impairments, which in interaction with various barriers may hinder their full and effective participation in society on an equal basis with others. So this, I will delve a bit further into what impairment, interactions, barriers, and so on means in the next few slides. But I do want to be really clear, this is the human rights-based approach for disability. It doesn't say people with disabilities that they're responsible for managing their own disability. It's about a social responsibility to remove these barriers, to stop people with disabilities from being unable to participate. But I'll cover it a little bit further in the next few slides to help give you a bigger picture of this. And please, at any time, if you're not sure, or maybe you might disagree with what's being said or have some questions and concerns, please pop it in the chat and I'm happy to answer it. But to let you know, I'm not watching the chat box at the moment because I can't read English at the same time I'm signing in Auslan because they're two different languages. So please be patient, but you're welcome to pop it in at any time. I did cover this before, I won't repeat this one. Oh, actually, why all Australian development and humanitarian work must include disability in its projects. Assumptions about people with disabilities. Because yes, people with disabilities are part of our community, all communities. They have human rights the same as everybody else. They have a right to participate. They're not just this weak, vulnerable community that we need to look after. They are not. We're not these vulnerable people. Yes, some circumstances can be vulnerable, but people with disability, then they're not a vulnerable cohort that we need to look after. They have their own strengths, their own abilities, their own unique opinions and ways to contribute. We don't need to hold their hands. They can come along with us. Now, some statistics. 1 out of 7 people globally have a disability, which equates to 15% of the world population, which means 1 billion people. That's why it's so important. That is so many of us. We are everywhere. 1 out of 7. And 80% of that 1 billion figure live in developing countries, which equates roughly 20% of that number are the poorest of the poor. And you being here today, you work in developing countries, so you know what that looks like. You need to make sure that it's inclusive work. When you involve families of people with a disability, that goes up to 25% of people with a disability in their families are impacted by disability. The person with a disability, their family around them, the family unit, are also impacted. Perhaps it's a higher cost for caring for their disabled family member, whether it's appropriate food, maybe they require more water, and so on. Disability does contribute to poverty. I'll go through that quickly. People with disability and their families face many barriers to access things like rehabilitation, education, skills training, and employment. And then that increases poverty and the cycle can continue. And on top of that, poverty then contributes back to disability. So it is a cycle. The reason that is, if you're poor, then you have limited access to health services. And also to prevent getting an illness or to impact your recovery for when you do get an illness, it can be extended. You're more likely to accept unsafe working situations because of the risk of loss of income. So you may be more likely to working in an unsafe environment and more likely to live on the worst land and more likely to be affected by natural disasters. And if you're poor, it makes it challenging to afford appropriate food, which leads you to a risk of malnutrition, which can lead to acquiring a disability or increasing your risk of disability or increasing the effects of your disability. You can see here in this picture, there's a girl in a wheelchair and she's arrived at school. She looks ready to go to school. She's got her books and all her things on her lap. She's there. She's ready to go. There's nothing stopping her except she can't get into her school because of the stairs. This is that equation, impairment plus barriers equals disability. I'll talk now about the categories of disability. There's 4 broad categories that the CRPD recognises. The first being physical, which is what most people think of when we talk about disabilities. They could be amputees, paraplegic, spina bifida, just to name a few. And it's not always the lower half of the body, it can also be the upper half as well. Sensory, which is like signing deaf, blind people, those that have barriers to communication. Psychosocial, which is in connection to mental health, whether it's schizophrenia, depression, bipolar disorder, and so on. And intellectual. This can be people with Down syndrome, autism, cognitive impairments, learning disabilities. So they're the broad types of disabilities. And they all have very different types of barriers as well. As Ipul said earlier, people with disabilities are so diverse. They could be parents, they could be children, they could be involved in church or not. They could be living remote and rurally, or they may be urban dwellers. They could be poor or wealthy. They could be farmers. They could be well educated, employed. The impairments can be just as diverse. And I want to be clear as well, even different impairments are diverse. Like earlier, Ipul had said those 2 examples about people in wheelchairs and having similar types of experiences and barriers is not always the case. We can't go by the one-size-fits-all approach because even 2 people with the same impairment type can have very different experiences. Barriers are diverse as well. Policy on institutional barriers, that's one of the challenges we have. If the policies don't recognise disability or don't have laws in place to protect the rights of people with disabilities or include them, the way the policies are written, then there's more than likely they're going to be left behind and excluded and not being accepted or benefiting from the work. Physical And environmental, most people think of those, whether it's ramps, widened doorways, the layout of the environment. So not only internal as well, road quality, access to water, whether the taps are a turn handle or not, or whether they can even get to the source of water. Communication and information dissemination is really important, not only for sign language, but for example, today, I've got 2 interpreters here today for you, really. I can sign, I have no problem with my sign language. I can present and I can sign and run a workshop fine. But today you all have the disability because you don't sign. You can't understand me. So I've made sure that I've brought interpreters here to make sure that you can participate in this workshop. And yeah, and that leads to getting information in an accessible way. Attitudinal. That's one of the largest ones. If you think people with disabilities can't do something, then you won't do anything to make sure that they can. And that can relate to many things. People say, oh, people with disabilities get married, or, oh no, you can't go to school, you have a disability, or deaf people can't learn such and such. That's a big barrier. And that's connected to the stigma that's associated with disability as well. For many, there's many different stigmas. People may feel frightened, that others may believe that their disability was from God, or that they'd done something wrong to deserve it, or whether it was a result of witchcraft. It's really important to understand that disability is normal. It's just part of humanity and its diversity. It's not for any reason. It's not because somebody did something wrong, but that's part of attitude. And then it also links to people just not being open to listening or being welcoming, and people not even thinking about people with disabilities. The disadvantage is also diverse as well. The experience of disadvantage and poverty is not the same for all people with disabilities. Gender and disability. Well, women and girls with disabilities have the triple jeopardy, which means 3 things. Well, being female, poverty, and disability, which puts them at an extreme disadvantage to others. Their experience of disability, even if you had 2 women with the exact same background, the exact same disability, from the exact same area, with the exact same education, their lived experience between, a man and a woman would be completely different because of their gender. It's important to include both. I'll do a quick run through of how we can address and remove barriers. Physical barriers can be resolved from the universal design principles. There's resources for you out there you can look through. Attitudinal, to make sure that people with disabilities are actually involved. Because sometimes that can be enough to make people think twice. Oh, yeah, people with disabilities can do X, Y, Z. Providing braille, interpreters, audio descriptions, and other communication devices can help remove communication barriers. On that also includes using appropriate language as well, to make sure that you're talking about disability in an appropriate way. A lot of the terms out there are not quite right. We also have resources here to help you think about how you talk about disability appropriately. And that's involved in communication. And that includes your professional documents, your official workplace policies and documents, websites, to make sure that you appropriately can talk about disability and people with disabilities. It's so important. And this one, removing laws and policies that are discriminatory, to make sure that people with disabilities can be included and protected as well. Reducing barriers reduces disability and the impact. So, just checking on the time. I'm doing okay. I think I've got enough time. I will do a quick pause here to ask if there's any questions before I keep going.
Jen, thank you for starting this off so well, and we've already received some thank yous and comments like fantastic point, Jen. I do have one question that's come in for you. What's your advice and experiences with including people with invisible disabilities? How do you deliberately include people that you don't know have a disability? Thank you.
Great question. That makes me think as well. There's one more thing I do want to talk about, barriers. People who are born with a disability in comparison to people who acquire disability have different barriers as well. For people with invisible disabilities, yeah, they are often more disadvantaged and left behind. We've found research to say that deaf people, people with intellectual disabilities, people with psychosocial disabilities, those three groups are left even further behind than the others. And I think that's in relation to two reasons. One is, yes, they're often invisible disabilities. And also, secondly, they communicate differently. How can we make sure, well, that'll be the next part, but how you can work with DPOs and other organisations. So I'm hoping I'll answer that question soon. But if I don't cover the answer in my presentations, please remind me and then I'll give a direct response. One of the strategies you can use is to be as intentional and deliberate in your purpose when you're writing policies and documents. Just explicitly say you're disability friendly, that you're welcoming people with disabilities. Make it very intentional. Melita?
No, that's great. Just another compliment. What a wonderful presentation and eye-opener. So they're all the questions in the chat at the moment, but that was a great point you just made then about being very deliberate and having inclusive and yeah, language that really invites people to know that you're serious about being inclusive. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Melita. Word of mouth is so powerful. If people talk about something, they will talk about it and they'll say, wow, this project, this work, this organisation was so inclusive. They made me welcome, they gave me a voice, and it really will promote and get more people with disabilities included. As long as in a safe way, they'll know that you're a safe organisation or a safe facilitator, but it begins with being a safe person first. Okay, I'll keep going. Over the next few slides, we'll be talking about how to make people with disabilities involved. One of the things that we really strongly push for here at CBM is working with DPOs. I'll explain a little bit more about that in a moment, but first I'll say, what is a DPO? I think Ipul did before explain DPOs, and apologies if I repeat what Ipul said earlier. DPOs are disabled people's organisations. They are for people with disabilities. A minimum of 51% of their board and staff must have a disability. Their members are those with disabilities in the communities and their families, perhaps. A really good DPO will have people with disabilities as the leaders of their organisation. If a DPO has staff who has a disability, but they're not in a leadership position, can be a bit questionable. DPOs will represent the interest and the demands of their members. They can be a local DPO, they can be a provincial DPO, or they can be a national DPO. Or they can also be a regional DPO, and even larger than that, an international DPO. An example of a regional DPO is the Pacific Disability Forum, PDF. They represent the interests of all the Pacific people with disability. An example of the international DPO is the International Disability Alliance. An example of a national DPO would be PNG ADP, like Ipul had said earlier, which she was a former chairperson of. DPOs can be cross-cutting. They may cover all disability types, physical, deafness, blindness, psychosocial. They may cover all, or they can be specific to the impairment, whether it's a deaf society, a deaf association, blindness organisation. Or it could be a group with women with disability only, or a group for families of children with disabilities. They can be just as diverse. The DPOs involve what? Information sharing, advocacy, and sometimes, but not always, sometimes they can provide some services at a cost. They are usually funded by their governments or mostly run by volunteers. They have their own interests and their own advocacy goals. So it's really important to remember that as well. If you do approach a DPO to work with you, you're being as proactive as possible, which is great. We love to hear it. And you want to target a particular DPO to be involved in your project and you invite them along, they might say no. The reason being is maybe they don't have the capacity, or often DPOs are so under-resourced and over demand. A high demand is placed on them. Maybe their interests and needs and advocacy goals with their strategic plan don't align with the project that you're working on and what you want to achieve. And perhaps these relationships have become too extractive. You tell them to come and help you to do something with you, but it's not really an agreement where there's mutual or sorry, it's not a mutual benefit for both people going both ways. The number one, I must say, is if you involve DPOs, you need to pay for their time. You need to pay them for their time, their expertise, and their knowledge, as you would with any other consultant that you employ. Just because they have a disability or an organisation like a DPO doesn't mean that they're any less worthy of being paid for their time and knowledge and resources. So, how can DPOs work with you? There's a few examples here. For example, you might have a project where you want to engage with people with disabilities in a specific location. The DPO can connect you with those in the area. Perhaps you have something you want to do, but the policy isn't accessible and you may need help for them to support changing your policy. They can also help connect you to specific services to help you achieve your goals. They could also run trainings for your staff, or they can attend your trainings that you run. They can be involved in projects from the start to the end. And also being involved with M&E, monitoring and evaluation. They can give advice to your project. They can be involved in your steering committees, also within your stakeholder engagement groups, and they can also engage with your advocacy work. They can contribute to project design and situational analysis. There's so many different ways that DPOs can be involved. The sky's the limit. Well, actually, no. DPOs' interests are the limit. Earlier, Ipul spoke about the twin track approach. I won't cover that because I think she did a really good overview of it. But with my picture here, this just talks about the twin track approach is both mainstreaming for society, mainstreaming within the community, for people to realise, yep, okay, people with disabilities are involved. And then the other side is building the capacity of people with disabilities so they can be involved in decision-making processes and be aware of what's going on. Disability-specific activities would be targeted to people with disabilities to make sure they participate and they're included. Mainstreaming means that they can access and participate on an equal footing to everybody else. The next slide has a good example. I won't go through all of this. I'll just show you a quick example for each one. Mainstreaming is community meetings are accessible and people can participate. Disability-specific activity could mean building capacities of DPOs. Or you make sure that community-based services are available in the region for the local community. You're not segregating it, like I said before, about segregation. It's more about making sure that they can both benefit. Making sure the communication materials you have is accessible. That covers the mainstreaming, but it also will benefit people with disabilities. I'll do a quick run through about how to make a project disability inclusive. Number one, ensure people with disabilities participate. Number two, identify barriers and remove them or reduce them to ensure an equal outcome. Thirdly, have the resources and plans to make sure that it happens. I've got a couple more slides left, but I do want to touch on one question that was mentioned earlier in the chat about budgeting. And that is one of the biggest challenges, one of the things we hear over and over again, that it does come back to budgeting and available funds. You need to make sure that you do budget for reasonable accommodations from the start, so you can include people with disabilities from the very beginning. Research has found that retrofitting can be more expensive than including it in the budget from the get-go. In our other strategies at CBM, there's other activities that we might not have time for, but we do an activity where you can see what happens if you make cuts throughout the project cycle and how it impacts people with a disability. If you make the decision, oh, this is too expensive, we won't do that, it can actually create more harm to the project. Your project may not achieve what it was set out to achieve. Maybe your goal was that 90% of the community will benefit from this, but not being inclusive for people with disabilities, it's really hard to reach those goals to have a successful project if you're missing members of the community. I do recognise though, it is a challenge, but it's not that much additional to make sure that your communications are accessible. It's not a lot more to, deliberately include people to attend your planning meetings, that these things can be accessible. You can be really clever and strategic in making sure that this does happen. I'll pause here quickly just to check in if there's any questions or comments. I've got about 3 more slides left to go.
Thank you, Jen. I don't think we have any more comments that have come in. So feel free if anyone does have anything to follow up on around that content that Jen has just provided, twin tracks, budgeting, any of those other topics. So we might just let people have a think about that and add them in the next couple of minutes, and maybe you can keep going, Jen, because I think people are all good for now.
Beautiful. Okay. To make sure people, or participation of people with disabilities, there's some ideas here. Actively reach out to people with disabilities, work with DPOs, support people with disabilities capacity in leadership and decision-making roles. For example, sometimes we have heard how people have organised perhaps a community consultation event, for example. They've made sure that people with disabilities can come, they've made sure that the venue's accessible, they've had interpreters present, they've done everything they can. They ticked the did for all boxes, they did all the right things. But people with disabilities didn't actually participate in the meeting. And that can be linked to the attitude of the community. Perhaps they didn't feel comfortable to speak up in that space, that they wouldn't be listened to. In those times, it may be necessary to have a separate meeting, or you need to be very intentional and to point people out and say, do you have a question or do you want to add something? But you need to be aware that this can also lead to backlash as well. It's not that common, and I don't want to delve into this now, but we have heard examples of projects where they've done everything right to be disability inclusion, but the community wasn't happy with the outcome. And they were angry with the person with the disability, and it was nothing to do with them, it was about how the project was handled. And it's just important to be aware and conscious of being inclusive. Make sure your projects and activities are adaptable to suit people with disabilities so they can participate. Consider about the diversity of disability. If you've only got representations of communities that are only from the blind community or physical disabilities, or only men with disabilities attending, then you know you've got a problem. That's not really not going to reflect a diverse accessibility needs of the whole community. Identify and reduce barriers to ensure equal outcomes. You really need to understand the barriers that are for the people who are working in the areas you work in. Ask the DPOs to help you with that, because you won't be able to think of them all yourself. For example, you might see me here signing today, you might think, great, cool. When I go talk to a deaf person, I'm going to bring a sign language interpreter. But maybe that deaf person prefers to speak for themselves or don't use an interpreter. So it's important to be aware of what barriers occur in context, and take very proactive steps to make sure that attitudes and physical and communication and institutional barriers don't exist. Include people with disabilities in mainstream projects as well. Resources. You can develop a disability inclusive action plan, allocate budgets at the very start, not later. Ensure that your staff have an understanding and build on their capacity, that they will be working with people with disabilities and how to be more inclusive. Be comfortable to include people with disabilities. Don't leave it, allocate staff responsibility for someone to make sure that the work is disability inclusion, that it is inclusive and that it is happening. Partner with DPOs and other organisations, as I said earlier, and monitor and evaluation. Monitor and evaluate your disability inclusion and collect your data. There's a data collection tool called Washington Group Questions, and they have 6 short questions just to help you desegregate the data when you're collecting it for your M&E. And I'm happy to share that later on. It's not a diagnosis tool. It's not used in any other purpose. It's more in a way to help you get an understanding of the diversity of disability and the numbers in the area you're working in. And remember what? Disability inclusion is a process and an outcome. If you do something and people with disabilities are involved, that's great. But what does the involvement mean? Do they really benefit from it? What is the outcome? Okay, I think I'll stop it there. I'll stop share screening and then I'll ask for any questions or comments. And I'll also ask Ipul if there's anything that you want to add, if I've forgotten something, or maybe I've said something you disagree with, or maybe we agree, but it'd be great.
Thank you, Jen. Okay, we do have a question that's just come in. Thoughts on proactive inclusiveness in the current COVID-19 world, where possibly we need to rely more upon key contacts in country being aligned with our GEDSI commitments. And just before you answer that, someone has just mentioned that because of the way Zoom is set up to bring up the video of the person speaking, some people haven't been able to see you signing throughout your presentation, I'm sorry. So the instruction is that if everyone can go to Jen's picture, and then there's 3 little dots on the top right when you just hover over her picture. There's 3 little dots, and then you can just use that to create a drop-down menu, and then it says pin video. And that means that Jen's video will stay there in the top of your screen while her PowerPoint presentation occurs underneath. So for the video recording, we have that, but I'm sorry that we didn't give that instruction earlier for people to be able to see Jen talking. So hopefully you can find those 3 little dots and pin video, and then you'll be able to see her answer the questions from now on. And so, yeah, that question about COVID environment, very, very relevant. Thank you, Jen.
I'm so sorry that you didn't see the presentation and that you didn't have the setup correctly. To answer the question about COVID, yes, we have found a lot of information that COVID has had a big impact on people with disabilities and people being left behind. They're more vulnerable and susceptible to getting COVID because they're unable to participate in prevention methods. Also, the information that's being provided isn't always accessible, and there's an increased stigma because often with people with disabilities require touch, whether it's close support and so on. And that does have quite a strong connection to WASH. It's hard. How you make sure people with disabilities are included in a COVID world, I think the principles would be the same as what I said earlier, but also challenging because not all people with disabilities have access to technology. And that's the same with others that suffer from poverty as well, don't also access technology as well. I'm not sure if I'm really answering your question. If I haven't, please let me know and I can try to reframe my answer.
Thank you, Jen. I wonder if, because the question was also about key contacts in the country that they're aligned with and that they're working with, what's a way that partners, whether they've got existing connections in a country or need to develop new ones, what are some ways that they might be able to connect to DPOs or create or facilitate those existing connections? Thank you.
Yeah. We all have to adapt to the new world. We unfortunately can't travel like we used to. We can't be there on the ground. We can't physically move around as much as we used to and meet people, and it's challenging. DPOs, well, DFAT usually does share information of who you could contact, or you could contact us at CBM and we can point you in the right direction of the DPOs in country that we're familiar with, and we can help that introduction and building that partnership. You also need to adapt to how they're working now. If they prefer you only call through WhatsApp at this specific time, you need to accept it and adapt to that. It's heavily about adaptation Because if you think people with disabilities have to constantly adapt to the world, it would be nice if you adapted to us sometimes.
That's great. Thank you, Jen. And yes, the service that you provide at CBM of helping to connect people with relevant contacts is a very valuable service and a great first step. Thank you.
I'm just reading over some of the questions in the comments. I thought it was, how do we make sure that they're aligned with the GEDSI commitment while we're working remotely? Yes, that's a great question. I'm not sure if I'm the right person to answer this question. Perhaps Veitania could answer that question, or Melita even, because we are doing a lot of advising, trainings, a lot of work, but we don't always talk about how to do it remotely and how it aligns.
Yeah, great. And thank you for that clarification, because that is a different interpretation of the question and a really relevant one. Certainly from a researcher perspective, we are bound by really strict ethical standards at our university. And so we've needed to follow that through with COVID plans and ensuring that our partners are adhering to all of the commitments we've made to ethical practice. So that does require some additional training and conversations between us, which is done on Zoom, and also setting up some processes together so that our in-country partners are across those requirements, not only from a health and safety perspective with COVID, but as you say, the GEDSI commitments around ethical practice and rights-based approaches. So that's all just in your remote training, your conversations, creating processes and feedback loops, monitoring how your work is going. So it's a little bit different because you're not physically there, but you're not really always physically there either. The nature of the projects we do, we come in and out of country. So that trustful relationship with the partner, the in-country partners, is always fundamental to the work that AWP partners do. Potentially it is constrained because we can't spend time meeting and physically being present, but we certainly can continue a lot of those conversations and setting up those processes using Zoom, using WhatsApp. I use WhatsApp a lot with my partners with those check-ins to make sure that those good practices we've agreed to are being followed through. Jen, do you have anything to add to how we can do things remotely?
Yeah, I think if you ensure your partners really understand why disability inclusion is important, whether it's for gender or GEDSI, it being important, then they'll comply with it. I think it needs to come down to the understanding. I'm hoping that today's workshop is helping you understand why disability inclusion is important, and then you can share that with your partners. And I'm really hoping that we can hit the mark on that one to make sure that you have more of an understanding of why we're so passionate about it, why we want to make sure that disability inclusion is important and it does occur. Is there any more questions or comments? Perhaps Ipul, would you like to add anything to my presentation? Just reading the chats, there's a question there about partner organisations understanding barriers and boundaries and expectations. Yeah, I think you need to make sure that your partner organisations really do understand boundaries and expectations. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you, Jen. I think you've covered most of the answers to the questions that they have posed earlier when I was presenting. Value for money and relevant organizations or representative organizations in relevant countries. Sorry, let me. Yeah, so I guess, one of the questions or one of the difficulties a lot of development partners face or are challenged with is really identifying DPOs in the countries. And for the Pacific region, as Jen has pointed out, we have this regional body, and our regional body works closely with CBM. And so in cases where you may not know where they are, or people would usually point them to CBM because they've worked, CBM Australia particularly, they've worked closely with a lot of the DPOs within the Pacific region. And I think it's also the same in the Indo-Pacific, the Indo-Asia areas as well, so Asian countries as well. And so I guess what has happened now is a lot of the DPOs are now working in collaboration with disability service organizations in the country, particularly in the Pacific region, and partnering with the governments as well. So these are places where you can go to if you cannot be able to find out where the DPOs are. Yeah, I guess you've answered most of the questions, and that was good. I mean, it brings more meat to what I had presented earlier. So it gives examples of what it means, and it was good that I actually did not go through that because it was good you covered it. So thank you very well. Yeah.
Perfect. Thank you, Ipul. That's great. I have seen someone ask another question. Thanks again, Ipul. There was a question asked if there's any opportunities to run a similar workshop for our partners in particular. Oh, I see Veitania's already responded in the chat, all over it. AWP can help facilitate partners with CB and engage CBM like us to also help engage with DPOs in the area. Oh wait, it didn't answer the question. Sorry, I signed what the answer was written. And like I said before, I shouldn't sign and read at the same time. I was just a little bit over-enthusiastic then. For workshops, I think Veitania is the best person to answer that. But to let you all know that CBM does run many different trainings about disability inclusion. You can contact us directly, or you can contact us through DFAT or AWP as well to get the information from us. But really, at the end of the day, partnering with DPOs in countries are the ones you need to work with to really understand disability inclusion in that country's context. I hope that that's answered the question.
Yeah, and I'll just reinforce Jen's point that, to have that expertise on ground to run similar workshops, engaging with DPOs, that would be the best way to go. But in saying that, this workshop will be recorded, and we will be sharing that with our partners. So that is another helpful resource for, to provide.
Thank you.
Great.
Okay, well, I might jump in here if that's okay. And thank you very much, Jen, because that comes to the end of those questions that we had. It's also really great to know, and feel free in this next part to add any ideas you have as to what you would like and need going forward. Of course, this is just part one of our webinar series, and we do have our next session next week. But I'm going to now ask if you could please all jump into this Mentimeter. I'm putting the link in the chat so that it's very easy for you to get to, but I'll also pop it up on a screen. So this is a Mentimeter, just to ask you a couple of key questions, and then we can share it with the whole group, and I'll read out what the responses are. And I will just quickly pop up this slide. Apologies. Yes, because we are coming into the last 10 minutes of our session. So if you could please all go to menti.com and type in this code 3864 631, or you might even be able to just put your phone up to this QR code that's on the screen and it will take you there automatically. I'm going to do a real life trial. Yes, it actually did work. So you can just put your phone up to that QR code on the screen there and it will take you to the website, or use the link in the chat box. And it first asks you, what jumped out for you today? What was interesting or new? So if you could just all add just something that felt interesting or new for you today. And I'll show the results live on screen. Fantastic, already coming in. I'm not reading them out at this point because I don't want to muddle people who are still writing. I'll just wait a couple more seconds. Fantastic. Okay, if you continue through that Mentimeter, it will ask you another question, but I'll just read out a couple of the comments that have come in around what jumped out or what was new. Don't make assumptions, ask questions. It's a process and an outcome, disability inclusion. Some very practical and some good practical real life tips to assist my work. Impairment plus barriers equals disability. Certainly that picture of the girl going to school was really powerful, wasn't it? So much expertise, such diversity, reconsider my approach. Wow, get goosebumps with that one. GEDSI policy is a true way forward. The importance of engaging with DPOs and how best to do this. I've never considered inclusion and disabilities in many stakeholder engagements with community and never counted how many participants with disabilities at events. Now I'll start thinking about it as I feel it's important. Ipul's journey from not recognising herself as a disabled person to leading a DPO. Absolutely beautiful comments. So the next question that you may have found in the Menti is, what words come to mind when you think about a disability inclusive approach to development and water management? What words come to mind? Maybe it's not letting you move on. It should be allowing you to move on. Yes, great. So if you can move to that next one. Great to see these changing as your responses come in. Thank you. Fantastic. No one's left behind. Consultation, it's challenging but worth it. Listening, meeting local needs, inclusion for all. Thank you. And then we also have some of the challenges specifically around expense and time consuming, time intensive, budgeting, unpopular, difficult. So some of the challenges are identified, but the importance of consultation has obviously really come through in terms of what words come to mind when you think about inclusive approaches. Together. It's a lovely word. Okay, I'll now ask you to move to the next and final question for this Menti, and that is, what questions do you have, you still have, about gender equality, disability and inclusive approaches? And note that the questions you have that you're able to add to the Menti now will definitely help us for the next session, and we will respond to those questions in the next session. What I might do actually is, rather than read those questions out now, please do add them. But I'm going to put up this slide of our contact details because somebody in the chat asked, how do we get in touch with Ipul? So here is how you get in contact with her. And do please add those questions that you have for us for next week. Just take a couple more minutes here and then we'll finish the session.
I just wanted to add quickly, next week for the presentation, we are going to have another wonderful guest speaker as well. Her name is Chuchu, and she'll be joining us next week from Indonesia. And make sure you can come and hear about her experiences as well. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Jen. And yes, what I'll do is I'll also just pop up the agenda next week so that you have a sense of what will be covered. As Jen just said, we'll have Chuchu from Indonesia, and then we're going to go over some resources for partners, building on today's resources that Veitania and Jen and Ipul have talked about. And there'll be very practical, targeted resources for the water management sector. And then we're going to start to apply some of these principles and these ways of thinking and working to some real world examples for projects that are very similar to projects that AWP have funded. And we're going to, in groups, talk through how do we apply some of this thinking and these principles to those scenarios. And so that's when we start to really get into the nitty-gritty and the practical element of the workshop. So everyone will have an opportunity to engage with several scenarios, and we'll then share the learning from that scenario work together. I have one comment in the chat. Enjoyed the session today. Thank you, and looking forward to next week. So yes, please pop it in your diary. I'm sure it's already there. for our session next week, which is on Wednesday. And it is at 1:30 p.m. Sydney, Canberra, Melbourne time and Papua New Guinean time. And that it will go until 4 o'clock. So we really look forward to seeing you 1:30 next week. Feel free to add more questions to the Menti after today, because we'll check those questions over the next few days. So you've got a bit of time to add more questions and comments to the Menti. So please keep that link handy. We'll probably also send it to you in an email. So thank you, everybody, and have a really fantastic rest of your day. Thank you to our team who delivered the workshop today, especially Jen and Ipul, Veitania, Shannon. Thank you all.